Welcome back to the New Levels Coaching Podcast. Remember, we are the coaching podcast that brings you lots of coaching, inspiration, education, so you can literally go away and run with it. This week is all about strength and conditioning. The whats, the hows, how regularly should you be doing it in your plan? Should you be doing it in your training plan? And I wanted to bring a guest on, firstly, who I know I can trust, and somebody I know who has one of the best reputations worldwide for strength and conditioning, and certainly is regarded as one of the best practitioners in this field, not just here in the UK, but around the world too. A lot of you may be familiar with the name Dr Rich Blagrove, or Rich Blagrove, as I know Rich by. Rich has his own book, which I've strategically placed to the left-hand side of him. So I haven't used it just as a prop, but it is there. We won't be using it, but I'm sure we will be referring to it as we go. So you may have read Rich's book before, and you may have seen him on workshops, on certain webinars, or you may have met him at certain conferences in the past. But Rich is a very, very knowledgeable person who I still rely on to this day, and I thought there's nobody better to bring on to the podcast to talk all things strength and conditioning. Where I'm going to kick off though, Rich, well, firstly, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for that really generous introduction, buddy, and invitations to come on today's podcast.
Well, thank you for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us. I'm going to start by asking Rich, I've given a little bit of a brief introduction there, but can you give a bit of an insight into your background, maybe starting from your running days and then building up all the way to where you are now, which is now back at Loughborough University?
Yeah, sure. I'll try not to bore you too long with an autobiography. So yeah, like you say, I originally came from a middle distance running background. So I was a student in this town, Loughborough, coached by the late great George Gandy for quite a few years. And yeah, I was an all right standard at running, not quite as good as you, buddy. I think
when you say all right, what do you define by all right? Because it's a little bit better than all right.
I was always kind of ranked in and around the top 20 through like under 15, under 17 age groups, around 152 when I was 19 here as a student. But yeah, I certainly wasn't ever good enough to get a Great Britain international vest. And yeah, I had quite a lot of injury problems. And so just before I left Loughborough University, I actually switched sports to rowing. And yeah, just kind of found out by accident that I was a little bit more talented at rowing than I was at running. And because of the endurance base that I'd developed as a runner, I seemed to excel quite quickly at rowing. And I did that for 4 years and trained with the national squad. And yeah, I mean, looking back on that experience, it was incredibly useful because they've got an incredibly professional setup at Great Britain Rowing. It's a really well-funded and supported program. And yeah, a lot of the rowers, as you know, are incredibly successful at Olympic level. So kind of watching how they operate and being part of that for 2 or 3 years was really valuable. But yeah, alongside that, I was actually starting to become more interested in strength and conditioning. So I started off doing a little bit of work with a football and basketball academy about 15 or so years ago now. And I was doing a bit of teaching as well. They managed to secure a job at St Mary's University down in southwest London as a lecturer in strength and conditioning. And I'm sure most of your listeners kind of know about the sort of culture and tradition of St Mary's and that part of the UK, that there's a lot of runners there and it's been a centre of excellence in the past. So I kind of naturally started to do some strength and conditioning support with the runners that were based down there, both because I enjoyed it and yeah, it sort of came naturally to me that I could work with that group. And yeah, I've worked with quite a few successful runners down at St Mary's, and I seem to be getting more and more inquiries from other runners around the UK and coaches asking about what they should do in terms of strength and conditioning for their runners. So I guess as you sort of naturally do, you write a book on it.
As you do.
Yeah, you've got a bit of a resource to point people to. So I think the book's kind of served its purpose in that respect, and yeah, has sold quite nicely. And then yeah, I left St Mary's in 2017, and I was just starting to get involved with more research and move a little bit away from S&C coaching with runners. I spent a couple of years at Birmingham City University working, and then when I finished my PhD, which was looking at the use of strength training with adolescent distance runners, I managed to secure a job back here and kind of go full circle and start at Loughborough University as a lecturer in physiology. And I'm now a senior lecturer and still at Loughborough.
Still going up the chain. And it's interesting how you've come full circle and now you're in that physiology domain. I was chatting to Steve about it this morning when I was in the physiology lab, and we were chatting about how not many people combine physiology with biomechanics. And I said Rich will be one of the closest to that now with the S&C background and the physiology background. But I always see them as being very closely linked, particularly strength and conditioning, physiology, and the biomechanics, and how they all work together to help improve or how they affect performance.
Yeah, absolutely. And if as an S&C coach, you sort of choose intentionally or unintentionally to specialize in work with an endurance sport like I have, you have to know about the physiological limiting factors behind performance in the sport to know where the strength and conditioning activities fit in. And if you kind of make assumptions or you don't really understand what limits performance in endurance sports, then you're not really going to be able to apply strength and conditioning principles to the athletes that you're working with.
It's a really interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And we'll go into a little bit of the science as we go. But where I want to start is I want to strip it right back to basics. And
absolutely.
We've mentioned your book a couple of times. I'll put that in the show notes for people who maybe aren't familiar with it, because it is a really good, we still use it as coaches as a tool. Like, it's really helpful for us as coaches. And at St. Mary's, I worked with you as an athlete, which is why I know I can trust
One
that.
of the successful ones.
Yeah.
That I mentioned.
One of the many successful ones, Rich. One of the many successful ones. And well, in fact, when you were writing the book, you're saying, I'm going to be writing a book. I'm going to use some of the images that we've been doing. Then I moved away from St. Mary's.
Yeah.
So I couldn't be in the book. But at the time we were working together. And I think that's why I have such a close association with the book and yourself, because I could really relate to it and the journey I was going on.
Yeah, no, thanks.
So I'll pop that in the show notes so people can check that out. But I want to go right back to basics and for people to understand, well, what is strength and conditioning? Because people hear the term S&C a lot. We see a lot of influencers out there, promoting themselves as S&C coaches, and we'll certainly debunk some myths as we go today. But I wanted to get from a professional, from somebody who is in that field all the time, to give a simple definition of, well, what is strength? What is conditioning? Are they different? And what do people need to know about the two?
Yeah, so strength and conditioning is essentially about the complete physical preparation of the athlete, mostly in terms of any sort of physical training activities that take place outside of their own kind of technical and tactical aspects of their sport. So as a kind of really simple example, and I guess taking it away from running briefly, like a footballer will obviously play a lot of football, they'll do a lot of set piece practice, they'll do some small-sided games, but then they'll do a bunch of other physical training activities, which might be lifting of weights, it might be doing some plyometric training, it might be foam rolling, it might be stretching, it might be kind of some core stability type work, it might be some additional kind of cardiovascular type conditioning. And all of those extra training activities that sit away from football would be part of a strength and conditioning coach's remit. I think there's two kind of global aims of strength and conditioning. Firstly, to try and improve performance, which is the most obvious one. So kind of goes back to what we were referring to before, that a key part of a strength and conditioning coach's role is just understanding the sport, the physiology, the biomechanics, to know how and where strength and conditioning is going to fit in. And then secondly, trying to reduce the risk of injury. And so with runners, that's mostly overuse type injuries. But we know there's some quite good evidence that strength and conditioning will reduce the risk of certain types of injuries in quite a few different sports. And I guess another big, another big part of the role is just, it sounds quite simple, but just relationship building, because same when I was working with you, like you never, as an S&C coach, just work with the athlete in kind of like a silo by yourself. You're always going to be working alongside a technical coach or a manager. If you're working at quite a high level, there's usually going to be a physiotherapist, sometimes a physiologist, a nutritionist, a psychologist. So you kind of formed as part of the interdisciplinary team, and you feed into, I guess, more sort of global decisions around the physical preparation of the athlete, which aren't just about the activities that you're responsible for.
I think that's a really good point to make about relationship building with the people that you're working with as well, not just the team around the athlete, but the athlete and the coach themselves. That's, for me, is super important. We see it a lot with the athletes who we work with, whether it's runners or triathletes, is that coach-athlete relationship is so important to success. One thing I would want to go back to, Rich, is around, we tend to call it, understanding the demands of the event. So I'm going to use running as an example here. I'm going to go back to my background as a middle distance runner, because I use a lot of examples of marathon naturally on this podcast. But as a middle distance runner, somebody who's focusing around 1,500 meters, maybe up to 5K if we're starting to go longer distances on the track. But it was really important for me to understand the demands of my event. And as you said, it's really important for you as the practitioner to understand the demands of the event. And I guess I don't want to throw every personal trainer under the bus here, but I think one of the problems we see with people who are getting support from personal trainers is there's maybe a little bit of a gap between what they set as a gym program and understanding the demands of the event for the runner. So for me, as a middle distance runner, a lot of that would have been, speed, strength, that ability to be able to generate power as well, particularly in a sprint finish. And there's a lot of other factors to also come into play. If we go to longer distances, for say the marathon, I think in all times, people used to get a little bit confusing. Oh, well, marathon runners don't need strength and conditioning because they don't need speed and power. But recent research has started to point more towards how important strength and conditioning is for marathon runners, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, the sort of physiological demands of the different events do overlap quite considerably, and they're mainly limited by physiological factors.
Yeah.
So you compare it to other sports and skills in other sports, they might mostly be limited by technique or biomechanics, whereas we know middle distance running, long distance running, and then ultra distance, they're all predominantly limited by sort of cardiorespiratory and metabolic factors. So we can't get away from that. But you're exactly right. Like there's, in the 800 meters in particular, but also 1500, we know there's anaerobic factors. So that's production of energy without the presence of oxygen are incredibly important. So the ability to run a fast 400, the ability to just have good maximal speed is absolutely key. And we know that strength training especially can play a major role in trying to improve those things. And then for the longer distances, we know that running economy becomes more important. And so that's how much energy that you're using at a sub-maximal intensity. And we know from a physiological perspective, that's the main physiological determinant that strength training can influence. And so if we can improve the amount of force we're producing and the way that muscles are behaving when our foot's on the ground, then we can improve running economy and therefore longer distance running performance.
And with the marathon in particular, that running economy is said to be the biggest determinant of marathon performance.
Yeah, it is. Yes, yeah.
And I know that from some of the research that I've read in the past, again, it's not just you mentioned a lot of things that fall into that strength and conditioning remit, but plyometric training is another thing that's been shown to potentially improve running economy. Again, it's one of the few things in the big umbrella, but it's got solid evidence around that.
Yeah, it has. Yeah. And I guess when we talk about strength training overall, we're talking about three main training activities. So we've got your sort of traditional heavy resistance training, so lifting dumbbells and barbells, that most people will associate with a strength and conditioning coach, like you're the kind of weights room coach. Then you've got more explosive resistance training, which is picking up like fairly light loads, but trying to move them really quickly. Yeah. And that can be right down to just your body weight as well. And then the third category that you just mentioned is plyometric training, which is, trying to drive adaptations to the stretch shortening cycle and the ability of particularly the Achilles tendon for runners to be able to store and return elastic energy. And we know that if we can improve stretch shortening cycle and Achilles tendon properties, then we get better use of this kind of free energy that we get from tendons, which enhances our running economy.
And plyometrics, they're not easy to implement. I've been doing them for years, and I still add them in now because I think they're super important. But they've got to be implemented gradually. In fact, I'm working with an athlete right now who we've put them in there, and we're starting off very basic double leg plyometrics, and then we're looking to progress to single leg, and we're going to progress the demands of those plyometric exercises as well. They're very demanding. We were just having a chat outside the podcast studio.
Yes, yeah.
They put a lot of demand, and people just think, I'll just throw these plyometrics in my plan. But there's a lot of things to consider when we do put things like that explosive in our plan.
Yeah, so certainly with plyometrics, because like the impact forces that we see with moderate to high intensity plyometrics are really high. And so with runners that are doing high volumes of training that have got like micro damage to connective tissues and muscles already, if you suddenly tried to do some high intensity plyometrics, like there probably is a little bit of a risk there. But there's also a bit of a misconception with plyometrics that you will hear like quite reputable strength and conditioning coaches, and it's said in a lot of textbooks as well, that like you need to do heavy strength training for years and years before you have kind of that strength foundation before you should even start doing plyometrics. But it's not really the case, because you need to think of any training activity, including plyometrics, along a bit of a continuum.
Yeah.
And so like just the act of jogging and running is plyometric by itself. And so if somebody sprints and if you're a marathon runner and you don't sprint very often, like that would be considered a sort of moderate intensity plyometric for most runners. And so as you say, you put somebody back on 2 feet and you do an exercise like some pogo jumps where you're trying to bounce as high as possible and spend a short time on the ground. Like that's a sufficient intensity plyometric to drive adaptations with most. And so you don't necessarily need to have done resistance training for years to build up the tolerance to that type of work. And then it's just a case of, like any training activity, just gradually nudging it forward using the principles of progressive overload over a long period of time. And not necessarily doing anything too in high intensity too quickly.
And I think that's what I see a lot particularly on social media now. You see somebody demonstrating like a real high level plyometrics in, the best plyometric for marathon runners. And you think to yourself, God almighty, don't start there. You show them the progression, but people want to see the fancy stuff. They want to see people jumping high. That's what gets people attracted to it. Sometimes the basic stuff isn't the sexy stuff, as we say, so people don't look at it
absolutely.
as much.
Yeah, I mean, it originally comes from the old kind of former Eastern Europe bloc approach to doing plyometrics, that they used to call it shock training. And so the very first exercise would be put an athlete on a 60 centimetre box, or sometimes higher, and they have to step off and land and rebound off the surface, which is incredibly intense. And if that's the very first exercise, for most runners, that's completely inappropriate and is going to be risky. But there's obviously lower intensity versions of plyometrics that aren't kind of this shock type training.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll maybe go on to like where people can start with this in a second, but I want to go back to your point you made about one of the main purposes of strength and conditioning of all the elements that we're talking about here, whether it's lifting heavy weights, whether it's plyometric, whether it's moving lighter weights at faster speeds, is to help reduce our risk of injury, because injuries is a massive problem. No matter what standard of runner you are, everybody will suffer from some kind of injury. I think I read something somewhere that there was a study done and 75% of people had said they had suffered it or had time out in that calendar year due to an injury. And the publisher of the study said the other 25% were lying. So then you think, why do we do this mad sport if we get injured? But it is common that we get injured, but there are certain practices that we can put in place that minimize that risk, strength and conditioning being one. Now, I'm going to go back to the weekend. Josh Kerr won
it's a great result.
The 3,000 metres indoors. For those of you who aren't familiar, Josh Kerr won the indoor 3,000 metres at the World Indoor Championships up in Glasgow. Josh is also world champion outdoors over 1,500 metres. And he said something in his interview that really stood out to me as a coach. And he said, consistency is everything for me. I'll beat anybody at consistency because I don't do the most amazing sessions. I don't overdo it, but I keep consistent. And I know that strength and conditioning is a big part of his plan as well. And I think if you manage things well, you are more likely to be consistent. But by adding strength and conditioning into your plan, you give yourself that chance of being more consistent, which in turn will also lead to improvement. So it's not just the improvement from the strength and conditioning we're looking for, it's the improvement of being able to run more or being more consistent with the running, which is also a benefit from strength and conditioning.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There's always a lot to unpack with injury prevention, but I guess starting with just purely strength and conditioning, we actually quite recently had a paper published in a journal called Sports Medicine, which is a really reputable journal, which directly reviewed all of the studies that have used strength and conditioning as a way to try and prevent injury with runners. Actually, the overall conclusion or message that came out of it it sounds a little bit contradictory, but it was that strength and conditioning probably doesn't reduce the risk of injury. But we actually did what's called a post hoc, or a kind of like sub-analysis of a collection of studies that had used supervision, or there'd been a coach present in some way, shape or form at the sessions. And what they found in those 3 studies was that the adherence was higher, probably the technique of the participants actually doing the exercises was a little bit better, and they all found positive effects.
Interesting.
So there's both a little bit of a kind of, as you say, engagement and consistency message there, as well as it might be valuable to have a coach that's qualified that can kind of watch what you're doing as part of the exercises. And if you engage with that over long term, there was a significant reduction in injury in those that had engaged with it. The evidence in other sports for the use of strength and conditioning, and the injuries obviously overlap, it is much, much stronger. So in military populations, in game sports, particularly in youth sports settings, that there's quite strong evidence that lifting weights and doing more general strength and conditioning activities will reduce risk of injury. It's just I don't think the sort of more general evidence is quite there yet with runners.
That's really interesting though, because in those settings you talk about, particularly those like team settings, youth settings, military settings, my understanding of that is it's more likely that they would be observed as well in those settings. So they're probably doing it more as a team, more regularly, and it's more observed, as opposed to these individuals going and doing what they want, when they want, and not really knowing what they're doing.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And certainly in military settings, they've usually got some sort of physical training instructor, and the studies are a little bit more carefully controlled in that respect. In a lot of the youth and game sports settings, it's in football or soccer, and so they're working with academy kids who have got strength and conditioning coaches present, and they're running some sort of training intervention. Whereas, in a lot of the studies we looked at in our review, it was often recreational runners preparing for a marathon, and they'd just be sent an S&C program, and then it was kind of like, well, let us know how much of it you do. And at the end of the study, not many had done it, and the injury rates were about the same in the 2 different groups. So certainly the quality of the research isn't as good.
So there's 3 things I want to unpick from this, because the first thing is, we talk about a lot, purposeful practice, I think, is so important. And when somebody's there, you're more likely to do it with purpose, and you've got eyes on as well. So it just makes it more purposeful. Whereas what we're talking about here is when people are sometimes left to their own devices, you can become lazy with it and sometimes neglect it, or sometimes not even do it. And we see that a lot with people who we coach. They think, that's not the important thing. The running's the important thing, so I'll do that first.
Yeah. And it goes back to what we were saying right at the start about the kind of relationship building. It's about, I guess, understanding the expectations of the runner and the technical coach, and initially just trying to kind of gauge what the motivation levels are like for strength and conditioning. And if it's pretty low, which sometimes it is, it's about trying to find exercises or an activity that they engage with a little bit, and they sort of get a bit of a hook, and they see, okay, there might be some value here. They do it consistently. And then it's layering on different approaches after that. And sometimes that works best.
And that was leading on to my second point quite nicely around finding what works for you, I think, is really important. When it works for you, what activities work for you. But also, if you don't have the ability to, be with a strength and conditioning coach every week, could you have an accountability partner, a training partner there who just has eyes on you and or is videoing you, and you have that little bit more feedback, which can then in turn help you. Now, I know it's not having a professional there all the time, but it is that accountability partner that maybe helps you to be more purposeful as well with your training. And then the final point, which good old Hainsey, Alex Haynes, a good friend of both of ours, Alex, who's been on the podcast before, go back and listen to that episode. I'd encourage you to, because it's a brilliant episode. We didn't talk about strength and conditioning as such, but we did talk a lot about injuries on that episode. And Alex and I have always had that good relationship where when he was coaching me, we kept S&C in there, but he left it to my own devices. Now, he will be first to say, and I will be first to say, that if I ever drop S&C, my injury rate goes up. And that's still true to this day, by the way. That the better I apply myself to my S&C in general, the more consistent I am. And with the research, Alex used to be very good with this. He'd just say, I do like the research, and I'm going to listen to it, but I also like things that are black and white. If you're telling me that works for you and you're good with that, then that's good for me. And I sometimes think that's important, isn't it, for athletes to understand what works for them?
Yeah, 100%. It's both what works for them and what they're going to kind of buy into. And if they're buying into S&C, they see some sort of value and they're going to do it religiously, then I guess it's much more likely to have a positive benefit. I mean, I guess the other thing that I would say just about injury prevention generally, and you'd have spoken about this with Hainsey and with other guests, is that S&C is just one aspect of it. Yeah. And what the research does tend to do is it will look at just one aspect. And we know that the reason that most athletes in general, but definitely runners, get injured is multifactorial. And so part of an S&C coach's role and remit, and this comes back to the sort of complete physical preparation of the athlete, is to go in with a much more kind of holistic, interdisciplinary approach, where you're potentially looking at things like, are they eating enough? Are they eating enough of the right sorts of foods? Have they got good energy availability? Do they get enough sleep? Like, what's going on in their rest and recovery periods? Are they going shopping, or are they lying down on a sofa? What previous injuries have they had? Because we know that that's the main risk factor for future injuries. And then, as you mentioned, kind of feeding into the overall workload, that if you ramp up the S&C at the same time the technical coach is ramping up the S&C, that's a kind of training error, inappropriate training behaviours, which are potentially going to cause some sort of injury. And then there's other kind of quite small things which have been shown to be risk factors for injury that potentially the S&C coach can influence as well. And so it's trying to come in with a much more holistic approach rather than thinking weights is going to stop you getting injured, because it might not. Just that by itself.
Let's look at that kind of multifactorial approach then, Rich, because I think rest and recovery is so important. And we see with a lot of athletes who we coach online that they're so reluctant to take time off. Like, even on a day off, they find it really hard to put their feet up, to lie on the sofa. And I get that, because people want to be active. And, you know, we're definitely in a society now where it's almost promoting us to be more active. So they feel lazy by taking a day off. But what's the importance of that? And you mentioned it there about, okay, well, injury risk isn't just one factor. How do we tie all that together to say, well, rest and recovery is also a big factor in that picture?
Yeah, I think a lot of it's about trusting the coach and the process, and having a coach that is willing to kind of make that call and say, you've had a stressful week, you've got stuff going on in your personal life, or you're feeling a little bit run down for whatever reason, and to say it's going to be sensible just to skip tomorrow morning's run, or just take the whole day off and try to relax and try to put your feet up a little bit. And then, yeah, the athlete trusting that and actually following the instructions. And again, that then goes back to what you say. It's like, in the short term, it feels like you're being lazy. And yeah, maybe if you have a few of those days, like in the short term, your performance might drop a little bit, but longer term, you don't get injured, ill, or overtrained. And so it fulfills this principle of consistency, that you're just able to run regularly, and that way performance will definitely improve long term.
Yeah, take a couple of days off now to prevent taking weeks off down the line
exactly.
that are going to impact
Absolutely.
it, or be in this cycle of constantly feeling tired or managing this niggle that just won't go away. Whereas actually, if you just listen to the body and taking that time in the first place, and linked to that as well, what we see a lot of people with is, I go back to the word periodization. So as coaches, we're very big on this at New Levels Coaching. We're looking to periodize people's training, particularly towards their big aims. Now, what we find with most recreational athletes is, particularly with runners and triathletes, is they'll enter like a big Ironman or a big marathon, for example, and automatically they've got their big target goal, and they are quite good at them mapping out their season for that. But if people don't have those big goals, they tend to get caught in this kind of ever-evolving season where they're just racing all the time, and they don't really have a periodized plan. And I think this is really important when we talk about strength and conditioning, because when I look at my plans for strength and conditioning, particularly for people who are on these long-term plans, I'm very conscious of what that strength and conditioning looks like at different times of the year.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to have that understanding as a coach, but also for the athlete to have that understanding of, this is why my coach is doing this, because they might see it as like, so the example I'm going to give here is the S&C for some of my athletes right now is quite high, because we're in like that big conditioning phase, want them to get strong. And as we go towards peak specificity phase, that S&C might drop a little bit. It won't go out completely, but it certainly might start to tailor off, because we can't have too much in the plan. But the mindset of some runners or some athletes will be, well, why are you dropping that down?
Yeah.
And that's really hard for them to grasp that. But what's the importance of that, getting the periodization correct?
Yeah, it is really important. And as you kind of alluded to there, it's about identifying what the long-term goal is, which I guess for most runners is going to be 6 to 12 months, and then trying to work backwards from that. As part of that process, I guess you do a more thorough kind of needs analysis of the individual, just to sort of find out, okay, how much background have you had in strength and conditioning before? What sort of injuries have you had through the last cycle? Because it's those things that you're going to want to try to address like quite early on. But the way that I tend to sort of periodize strength and conditioning is work quite closely with the runner and the technical coach. And the strength and conditioning almost kind of like preempts what's going to happen in the next block of work. So to use your example there, if you're going to do 3 months of quite high volume training, building up to a marathon where the long run of the week's prioritized, there's maybe like a second longish run in the week, and it's just for that individual, like relatively high volume. You can't kind of have really high volume strength and conditioning work alongside that as well, because it just risks injury or overtraining or illness. And so that S&C work kind of has to preempt it and come before it. So it might be the 2 months before that high volume block of running that you're doing a little bit more S&C to prepare you for that higher block of running. And there's other examples as well where I guess at the slightly higher performing level, we get a lot of runners going away on training camps. And the environment and the running terrain changes quite a lot on the training camp. And sometimes if they're a middle distance runner, they might be doing more track work in spikes. And so my S&C work has almost got to prepare the runner for that training camp.
Yeah.
If they're going into spikes, there's going to be more stress going through the Achilles. The higher intensity work puts more stress on the hamstrings. That if you try and fix those or try and prevent injury in those areas while they're on the training camp, it's too late. So you've got to have already done that work before they then go on the camp. And sometimes it's a training camp, but the S&C volume actually drops down a little bit to account and accommodate for the intensity of the running work. So yeah, it's just about kind of getting the balance and working with the coach.
Well, I'm so glad you're saying it, because I'm mapping out training camps later on in the year. We've got a new levels coaching training camp coming up in Portugal, which I'm really looking forward to. But I'm mapping out training camps for, particularly for James and Gemma, because they're going to Chamonix twice this year. And with their S&C, we're doing exactly that. So I'm glad you've said it, because I'm like, right, okay, I'm on the right lines. Because the specificity of those trails and that terrain will come when we're out there. It's quite hard to find it here, especially at the moment.
Yeah.
And I'm looking, saying, okay, well, what do we need to prepare the body for that we're going to see out there? So how do we condition ourselves as best as we possibly can, so that you're conditioned to deal with that environmental stress and what's going on, but also muscularly, how are you adapting now, so then you can definitely adapt out there when volume's going to go quite high out there, and the speed at which they're descending is hopefully improved as well, particularly for Gemma, who's improving her descending. In my mind, I'm using that preempting, like you're saying, of, okay, what stress is that going to put on her long term? How can we start to create that change now from S&C? Because the other thing is, she doesn't really get that stress right now from the running downhill, because she's not quite there yet. So I'm really glad you've used that analogy, because it works well in my head around the track.
Yeah.
But you can apply it to a lot of different disciplines.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It depends on the distance and the terrain and the challenges of that event. And you've essentially, trying to physically prepare the body and the athlete for those challenges and stresses. And we're not talking about kind of switching stuff on and off here. It's not kind of binary that I'm either lifting weights or I'm not. It's kind of dialing stuff up and dialing it down. So like at very most, a runner might be lifting weights 3 times a week at some periods of the year, whereas at other times it might just be once a week. Or you can adopt an approach that we term sort of microdosing. So instead of going to the gym for an hour to lift weights, it's maybe like 20 or 30 minutes. Where you're just trying to maintain the adaptations and the qualities that you've developed in previous phases, and making sure they don't disappear just by kind of dialing it down and increasing in other areas.
I think it's a really good point, the microdosing element, because I think a lot of people who we coach and a lot of our listeners will kind of be familiar with, not with the term, but certainly with that idea of, okay, well, going little and often is probably a little bit better for me, because they live very busy lifestyles. It's very hard for them to commit like an hour to 90 minutes to the gym. Although what I would say here is runners will find time to do an hour or 90-minute run. So sometimes it's sometimes one of those, do you want to do it and do you want to find time? But there are people who are saying, well, I can't commit an hour 3 times a week for strength. So I think that is a really interesting point, and I think it's an important point to address, that you can go and do some shorter sessions more regularly and still elicit that same benefit that you're looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. And the organisation, just in a general sense for S&C, like for me anyway, like it is quite individual. And I get this question a lot, like where's best to put the strength and conditioning in the week? And like my answer's kind of become, well, it's just best to do it. Just make sure you're doing it. Like where it kind of comes in the week is kind of a little bit secondary. And it might sort of give you the extra, I don't know, 5-10% in terms of just optimizing it. But the most important thing is it's in there somewhere. And then once it's in there somewhere, it's I guess it's kind of working with the individual, because if you've got a young athlete that's at school and they're there for 6-7 hours a day and they've got other stuff going on in the evenings, then you're going to be limited with where you can put it. And the same with somebody that's working like 9 till 5 every day. They've maybe got 2 or 3 kids. They've got a social life. Like there's only going to be certain places in the week that you can actually go. And so for me as the S&C coach, I come along and say, well, the research suggests that it's optimal to put it this many hours after a run, and it can't be on this sort of day. That you kind of look at you and go, that's just impossible for me to put in. And then they disengage. They say, well, I can't do it then. And it's like, well, where can it go in the week? Let's put it there. And then like maybe longer term, we can try to shuffle it around to kind of optimize it.
It's why we always start with the athletes we coach online. One of the first questions we ask is, okay, where can you fit things in? You know, we're looking at your programming here. What's the best days for the long run? What's the best days for your S&C? And often people come back to me or come back to us as coaches and say, oh yeah, but shouldn't I be doing my S&C on this day because that's what I've read? Or, you know, the classic is, oh, well, I've seen this athlete who does their S&C on the same day as they do their high intensity session. And is that not the right way to do it? And yeah, it's the right way to do it for them, but they're a full-time athlete.
They're a full-time athlete. They're not doing anything else other than just training and recovering.
That's it. And they have the time on their hands. They're also observed. They can adapt the session if they need to. They're going to go home and recover. They don't have to go to work. So again, it's easy for us to sit here, look on Instagram or wherever, Twitter, and go, oh, well, that's what, you know, so-and-so's doing. So that's the best way to do it. There's certain things we can take from the elites, which I think is the thing that you've just said there, Rich, is they do it.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's the biggest thing for me to take, is don't neglect this stuff, but don't think that you have to do it as religiously as they do, and certainly don't think that it has to be structured and set in stone as I've got to do it on this day or I won't get the same benefits. It doesn't work like that.
No, absolutely. And there's obviously a risk in any sports of kind of copying what an elite athlete's doing, but they've obviously built up to that over a long period of time. It's relevant and appropriate for their context and their lifestyle and their kind of background. And so if you see somebody throw up a training program on social media or a video of what they're doing, it's not necessarily going to be appropriate for what probably isn't appropriate for everybody. And so you've got to work with a coach that's kind of skilled enough to tailor your program for you as an individual.
And if someone's not working with a coach, because a lot of people who do tune into this, they are self-coach, you know.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
They do refer to whether it's plans offline, even running plans or S&C plans, or they might read your book. Hopefully now they will, and there's a lot of good guidance in your book as to how to structure your S&C, which is great, which is why I'd recommend people go and read that. If they're not working with somebody and they're thinking, I want to start to add strength and conditioning into my plan or some form of that, the general question we get is, where do I start?
Yeah,
you know,
sure,
what do I do? What sort of things can they even be thinking about at that stage?
Yeah, and it's like I never like to say, well, it depends, because it doesn't really help listeners very much.
But it does.
There's 3 things to consider. I guess the first thing is whether they've got any experience in strength and conditioning before. If they haven't, the priority initially is just to build up some competence and skill in basic movement patterns that you're going to want to load further down the line. And so in that regard, you can get away with initially just doing things in a home-based environment, and probably for at least a few months. You don't necessarily have to get a gym membership or, go to your Argos or whatever and buy some dumbbells or a barbell. And the second thing is, are people kind of willing to invest in a gym membership and maybe work with a personal trainer or a strength and conditioning coach? And if they're not, that then kind of constrains the type of activity that they do. And it might be better for those people to go the route of maybe a little bit more plyometrics rather than resistance training, because they're going to plateau in terms of their strength quite quickly. The third consideration, and we mentioned this before, is the biggest risk factor for getting an injury is previous injury.
Yeah.
And so if you're dealing with a runner that's not done strength and conditioning before, but has had a lot of Achilles niggles or IT band syndrome, or shin splints, but plantar fasciitis, whatever, they've got to address either the reasons they've been getting that injury, or do some specific conditioning for the tissues around that area. Because the likelihood that's going to come back is pretty high.
Yeah.
So those would be the first three things. I don't know, do you want me to kind of go on to, I don't know, maybe like an example program? Is that helpful?
Yeah, that'd be good. But one thing I was going to say there, similar to like a running program, really, when we get people who come in and we do that needs analysis, and we say, what problems have you had in the past? And similarly, they might have had injury problems or, problems of things that they're struggling to improve. And we look at that. And we almost go and say, well, that's the first thing we need to address. But also similar with the movement patterns and how you're moving, how you're lifting. It comes back to that point you said earlier, Rich, around if you're going to progress something, you've almost got to preempt it. So if we want people to run faster, then we've got to look at it early on in the program and say, okay, well, we know we want you to run faster in the long term. How do we start to address that now? And it's similar with lifting, isn't it? If I want you to squat heavy, we've got to get the movement right, or else you're not going to be able to squat heavy. So you, again, preempting that. So there's a lot of similarities there that cross over. But I'd love to hear a few examples if you can.
And I guess, I mean, my sort of standard S&C program for a runner that I haven't got that kind of individual level information on is pretty boring, unfortunately. it's just doing the basics pretty well. And so with lower limb resistance training, I generally go for some sort of hip hinge pattern. So what I mean by that is it's flexing at the hip, keeping your back nice and straight, and trying to load the gluteals and the hamstrings primarily. So exercises like a glute bridge to start off with are completely fine. I then go for some sort of squatting pattern. So kind of like hands-free squat, or some people call it like a zombie squat with your hands out in front of you, where we're trying to get thighs to around about parallel to the ground and maybe slightly under, is a really useful exercise. And then on one leg, I'll do some form of stepping exercise and some form of lunging exercise. So a stepping exercise in a home-based environment could be something simple like a kind of dead leg step up, where you're trying to keep your non-working leg as straight as possible. And an example of an easy lunge exercise is like a split squat, where you just take an exaggerated step forward, you drop your hips down to the ground, and you can kind of really feel your gluteal bum muscles being loaded quite nicely. So if people cover off those four bases, they're not going to go too far wrong, to be honest. I would definitely do something for calf Achilles specifically. And that's kind of, I guess, my philosophy as an S&C coach. So something simple like calf raises, people can do at home. And then I guess you kind of token up a body exercise.
Throw it in there.
A press up would be a simple start point. And there's obviously overhead pressing exercises and pulling exercises that runners can do as well. But that would be a kind of nice, sort of fairly well-rounded starting resistance training program.
What I love about what you've just described is, well, firstly, there's a really good article that you did with Runners World, which I think is like the 7 best exercises for runners. And
I think most of those are in there.
Most of those in there, and we refer people to that. So because I think it's really simple, really effective. But what I really like about it is my gym program, which I usually do on a Thursday morning, which would have been this morning. I haven't done it this week. The reason being is I'm racing on Saturday, and I just want to freshen up a little bit. So I'm quite happy to move my training around to suit that. So I'll put it in next week. But my S&C program still is. I've still got.
You've been doing it for 10 or so years at least.
and it hasn't changed much at all. But it's the hinge. So I've got an RDL in there. I've got a squat. I've got a back squat. I've still got dead leg step up in there. I've still got push-ups and pull-ups in there. I actually do a lat pull down as well.
Yeah, great. Yeah.
I've still got soleus loaded, seated soleus loading. I've still got box step, which is the step up that you talked about as well. So all those principles are exactly the same. I've just advanced them over time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, what you've just described is really similar to my kind of starting program. The only difference is you're working at a higher like absolute intensity. So you've got load on the bar. There's a little bit of added complexity to the exercises you're doing compared to my basic example. But as you say, the kind of key ingredients and principles are identical. They haven't really changed.
And I think if we go all the way back to the start of when I started working with you, yes, I did have a bit of an S&C background, but you stripped it right back where we did our needs analysis right at the start. We did an assessment to see where I was strong, where I potentially needed some improvement, but you were looking at how I actually moved, and we corrected that first, and that was in 2013, so wow, some 11 years ago, which seems
better
crazy,
memory than
me. So it's 2013 in Teddington when we moved down to London, and I still embed those same principles, but it was really important to get the movement patterns right then to allow me to progress to where I got to eventually. So I think it's just a really important point to say to people that don't be afraid to start basic and get them right first. But also what I will say is, don't feel like you need to change a whole heap all the time just because you think, I need to vary these exercises because they're not going to work for me. Yes, you need to vary the stimulus. Sometimes you need to lift heavier or lighter, and it depends what you're looking for from the session. But so many people come to us and say, are there any different types of exercises? Because I'm getting a little bit bored of these now. And I'm like, but these are the best ones.
And there's different ways you can kind of progressively overload and vary programs. And I try to utilize like all of the variables you've got available. So you got basic things like exercise selection. So changing up the exercises is a little bit less boring. You've obviously got number of sets you do, number of reps you do, and then that's reflective of the load that you're lifting and so on. Like even to some extent, you can sort of like shift around order of exercises. Yeah. So you could throw in like a little plyometrics exercise or an explosive strength exercise and kind of go, well, I want you to start off with your squats. I know we've been doing those all year, but they're really important. Then go over and do some box jumps or do some counter movement jumps on the spot or whatever. And they're like, that's a little bit more interesting and challenging. And so, it's just kind of, I guess, throwing in extra challenges, particularly for the type of runner that gets a little bit bored and stale quite easily.
What makes me laugh about endurance athletes is with the gym, they always want variation. But with running, swimming and cycling, they're happy to just do the same movement every single day and go out and do the same route.
The same route, I was going to say.
So, it is interesting.
Same time of day.
Yeah. we're creatures of habit in some senses. But
definitely.
When we're not as keen to do something else, we always want variation. To kind of round this all off, Rich, we've spoken a lot about being in the gym and some plyometric stuff, some explosive stuff as well as some movement stuff. But I'm also conscious that a lot of people have other activities in their plan that do fall into that strength and conditioning remit, as you said, even things like rolling, which could be categorized as being in there. So people sat at home, they're thinking, well, how is that a strength and conditioning element when we're talking about lifting weights 1 minute and now we're talking about potentially stretching at home or maybe doing some yoga or some Pilates? How do they all fit into that same bracket?
And I mean, I guess all those different activities you mentioned, I mean, with my kind of research academic hat on, like the evidence is a little bit mixed for all of them. But it again, it comes back to the discussion we were having before, that if people want to do them and they engage with them and they perceive that it helps them, like even if it is a sort of bit of a psychological stimulus in the background, like it probably does. Yeah. And so if I come wading in as the S&C coach and go, well, that's coming out straight away, like immediately the athlete kind of disengages with me, and then their perception of what I give them working is probably reduced a little bit. And so, some of those activities probably are appropriate. And again, it kind of depends on a little bit the background of the athlete. Like if you've got a particular area that's kind of biomechanically is being excessively loaded as part of your running stride, and it's something that's either difficult to change or you're kind of working on in the background. So you've got like a muscle or a kind of tendon it's just getting really, really tight and it's niggling all the time. And by doing the yoga or the stretching or the foam rolling, it kind of releases it. Like there probably is something physiological going on in terms of like a dampening down of the kind of neural pain signals a little bit. And then you kind of wake up the next morning, you're like, oh, that tightness, it's eased a little bit. Like I can go out for my run. Like it is sort of preventing injury, but it's probably only for that individual. Whereas if you just give the same prescription to everybody, like it's probably not going to help. and it eats into recovery time.
Yeah.
So if you're doing your foam rolling in front of the TV in the evening, like your heart rate's a little bit elevated, like it's not sort of proper high quality recovery compared to lying on the sofa. And so it's not kind of a blanket recommendation that all athletes should be doing all S&C training activities. It's going to depend a little bit on their issues.
I think it's a really important point to make that, and I think again it comes to purpose. So I'm going to throw Gemma under the bus a little bit here. she might listen to this back and be like, you get, but she has a habit of sometimes being on the couch and picking up like the pulse machine, the pulse drill thing, or she's then on the roller and I say to her like, okay, well, we need
dinner.
Just chill. And
I'm going cold.
I'm complete opposite. I'm like, I'll be sat on the couch and not doing anything. But my theory on it, and from the science behind it, and also just from the psychology behind it, is when you're resting, you should be resting. Yeah. So do your best to rest. And if you're going to do something, do it purposefully. So what I've said to her now as a coach is, I'm going to start to put this in your plan as to when you can do it and when you should be resting. And I think it's a really important point for people to know is, if you are on a rest day and it is a full rest day, then give yourself the time to actually rest, because these things like rolling and even yoga could fall into the conditioning element. So you are training, you're still training.
Yeah, definitely. It's just it's a kind of a low level physiological stress, but it's still a bit of a stress.
It's still a stress.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if people do really go at it on the foam roller, like you are pouring with sweat.
Yeah, it's a tough task.
Yeah, exactly. You sort of get an underlying hormonal and immunal responses that probably your body probably won't like very much, even though it might be doing something to the kind of connective tissue.
And I always find as distance runners, we're not the strongest upper body wise either. So you come off and you're like, Jesus, I've had an upper body workout there
exactly.
off the foam roller.
You've got veins popping out.
Yeah, that's it. Again, you get your conditioning in there.
Yeah, true.
But I think it's just really important to emphasize that when we're doing all these activities, we're looking for some form of stress to get that change, to elicit that change. And then we need the rest to go with it in order to then get the adaptations. And so many people are always looking to do.
Yeah.
And they sometimes forget about, well, I need to rest as well in order for this to actually, for these adaptations to take place, to get the real benefit from them.
Yeah, and it kind of comes, it's a nice kind of segue back full circle into something I mentioned right at the start, that when I was training at the GB Rowing Centre, they used to have this phrase, world-class training and performance, world-class recovery. And it was like the training was world-class. It was like the best coaches in the world, the best sports science in the world, and it was a well-funded program. But in between the sessions, I mean, they had the rowers have the advantage that they're all full-time, but in between the sessions, they literally do nothing but lie down, to the point that at the rowing centre, they used to have a bedroom with about a dozen beds that they could actually go and have a sleep in between training sessions.
Wow.
And so they didn't have to worry about anything. Like food's kind of on the table, on the plates. They didn't even have to make that. But it was kind of like world-class recovery. And if they would kind of get wind that you'd had, like a busy day out shopping, or you'd taken your dog for a 5-mile walk or whatever, they were like, that isn't world-class recovery. It's suboptimal recovery. And that's, like, again, in the short term, it probably doesn't make a difference, but medium to long term, it's going to start to niggle away.
All adds up.
Exactly.
It's a really good point, and to kind of wrap it all together, I think the stuff that we've spoken about, particularly when you're getting into strength and conditioning, S&C, about doing things from home first and movement-based things and rolling and then recovering optimally as well. So all these things are relatively cheap or even free. The things that you can take care of before you even have to start thinking about a gym membership or personal training. And I think that's sometimes what puts people off. They think, I've got to invest a lot of my money into this. Well, at first, you don't really. It's just a lot of time and energy and doing it correctly. But there is a really good starting point there for people, and it is about just that time investment and committing to it. And I feel like if you take that first step, that's when you really will see the change. But one of the big things we always say to people is give it time. Don't just expect to fall in love with it overnight. You just commit to it. Give it time to see that change, because it does take a lot of time, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it goes back to what we were discussing before, that occasionally I will get some runners that will approach me for help, and they almost kind of expect S&C to be like the golden bullet for the injuries that they've had in the past. And when you kind of look at their overall profile and maybe like their energy availability and like menstrual cycles with females, and then what's going on in their lifestyle. Like all of the factors we spoke about before, you realise, well, S&C is probably actually going to play quite a minor role in trying to kind of fix you and improve you as an athlete. And so it'll be part of it, but it's definitely not going to be a kind of golden bullet.
So as an overall conclusion, it's important, but it's only one of many factors.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
A lot of the factors we cover on different podcasts, we've spoken a lot about in the past: periodization of training, which is important; rest and recovery, which is important; lifestyle, strength and conditioning. Gemma's spoken about psychology and actually her approach to injuries, which is also important. But it just shows how much can go into it, and that multifactorial approach is important. I think all runners will be first to say that a happy runner is somebody, or a happy athlete is somebody who is exercising and they're not injured. So we all want to do our best to stay injury free. And I will attest for this, that I believe strength and conditioning helps me to do that. So if it's something you've not added into your plan before, then you certainly might like to think about it. I want to say a big thanks to Rich for coming on. Thanks, Rich.
Yeah, no, thanks again for the invite, Lewis. It's been great.
No, it's been really good. I've really enjoyed it. I always learn a lot from these, which is great. I'm going to pop Rich's book in the show notes, and anything that Rich feels might be appropriate as well, if there's any links to studies, as well as the 7 best. I think it's a 7. I'm pretty certain it's the 7 best.
Yeah, it rings a bell.
Yeah, 7 best exercises for runners, and that was featured in Runner's World. So yeah, thanks again, Rich. Much appreciated.
Yeah, great. Thanks.
For those of you at home, if you're not trying S&C, then maybe give it a try. For those of you who are, then keep enjoying it. Hopefully you are staying injury free. As always, we'll see you out there training, and hopefully see you at plenty of races in the very near future. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you soon.